I'm not teaching, I'm publicly learning. But hi and welcome to Learning for the Life in the UK test part 118, the right to vote part 3. While doing leg injury prevention training, if you participate in the leg injury prevention training, that is at your own risk. So we had that in the Act of 1832, the number of people who had the right in Britain to vote increased largely, or greatly. But there were still most men and women could not vote, all women not. Then there was a second act, a Reform Act for voting, and as in the first one, more seats for the towns and cities were made in the parliament. And yes, after the second reform, more people could vote, apparently also for working class. They said after the first vote, this meant that members of the working class were still unable to vote, so after the first reform. Then they said a movement began to demand the vote for the working class. At first they seemed to be unsuccessful, but in 1867 there was another Reform Act. It seems to mean that more people of the working class could vote. They don't say this in specific, but the amount of property necessary to vote was reduced. Not limited. Limited would mean that everyone has to have a limit. It was reduced. Minimized. But still, even after the 7 reform from 1867, the most men could not vote and all women not. But more people could vote. And the politicians had to reach out to more voters, and they created organizations to reach out to the voters. And it took another course of another century and a bit more to give all adult men and women the voting right. In common with the rest of Europe, women in 19th century Britain had fewer rights than men. So as they were telling us that it was usual at the time, but not something specifically in Britain. On that point, they're telling us. In common with the rest of Europe, women in the 19th century, so from the time from 18th to 19th century, but it's not just in that time, women had fewer rights than men, so legal rights in front of the law. And with the voting right bound to the amount of property, women had it way harder to work when not even mostly impossible, at least in the Industrial Revolution. Research, they had to work. That was the other reform act, that women and children maximum allowed for 10 hours a day to work, but it was harder to value up property, so there were more complications when just women cannot vote at all. It was then even more complicated after being completely excluded. So in most Europe and also in Britain, women had fewer rights than men in the 19th century. Until 1870, when a woman got married, her earnings, property and money automatically belonged to her husband. So when we have the Acts of 1870 and 1802, okay, so until 1870, when a woman got married, her earnings, property and money automatically belonged to her husband. So that means if a woman was not married, she could make money on her own, but I'm not sure to what extent. But we're knowing it the other way around. As soon as she had married, all what she earned, all which she possessed in money or in houses or whatever she could ever earn, belonged now to her husband. And we never got into that, but that was the reason why Queen Elizabeth I stayed childless. That she did not want to marry, because then the king would have come into our hands. And I think it was talked about the King of Spain, I think. The one who I probably sent out the Spanish Armada to conquer and recatolize England. So there's more to that story. They didn't talk about it, and I don't know much about it, but there's also something. It's not that just now is talk here that is like a line through all of history. Had an influence on all history and the people living there and on their fates. So Acts of Parliament in 1870 and 1882 gave wives the right to keep their own earnings and property. So first some part in 1870 and then another part in 1882 gave them the wives of husbands, so the female part of a male and a woman marriage, to the right that they can keep their own earnings what way. So when they have a job and they're working and they get the money for that they have worked for these 10 hours a day, that they get the money and not the husband. This is what was firstly said in 1870, and then 12 years later, so basically a generation later, after the generation had lived under these half rules, another time in 1882, but we don't want to speculate. In the late, no, let's do a bit like a Revenge-Stellen, the first bit in the city honest. We are starting with a trunk igniter. We're going down and breathing in. And out. And again in. And out. And again in. And out. Breathe in across the legs. And out. Now we're stretching a bit more. We're taking the leg by the ankle and we're bringing it down. And don't just bend back, but make a neutral position of the spine. You want to stretch the quads. And now we're taking the other leg by the ankle. And again, try to have a neutral position of the spine and to stretch the quads. And now we're bringing the leg in front. We're pointing the foot and we're stretching again. And on the other leg in front, the other leg up. And we're pointing the foot. And now we're doing one exercise. We're laying one hand onto the tummy and one onto the back. And we're lifting one leg in a straight line up. If the quad muscles cramp, bring them up and point the foot. Bring the leg high up and try to bring the leg high up. Control with the hands that you have in a position in the spine. Try to bring the leg high up. And try to bring it high up. Control that you have another position in the spine. Try to bring it high up. And bring it up. One foot. Hand on the other leg. Again, one hand on tummy and one on back. Bring the leg straight line up. Control that you have a neutral position in the spine. Try to bring the leg high up. And try to bring the leg high up. And bring it up. And follow the foot. And over to the next exercise. We are having a standing leg, and we're bringing the other leg, the heel into the ground, and lifting the heel off the ground and placing it again on the ground. The whole movement comes from the hips, don't do too many. Maybe 5 of them are already enough for you. So the Acts of Parliament in 1870 and 1882 gave women the right, the money which they had earned to keep. In the late 19th and early 20th century, an increased number of women campaigned and demonstrated for greater rights and, in particular, the right to vote. They formed the women's suffrage, I don't know how it's pronounced, suffrage movement and became known as suffragettes. Okay, we're having here universal suffrage followed in the next century. So 100 years around after 1870s, all men and women got a voting right. And here we have now that in the 19th and early 20th century, in late, so 1880 until 1910, 1940 was it? So in the 1910s, an increased number of women campaigned and demonstrated for greater rights. So more women campaigned and also demonstrated that they had more rights than just to keep their own money, but that they also in particular have a right to vote, that they can vote. That was still not here in 1910. So it took more than just 100 years, and that was a little sneak peek basically in the future here. So in 1870 and 1882, now we're changing the leg. In 1870 and 1882, women get the right to keep their own earned money. And then in the following 30 years, until I think it was 1914 or something, 1912, 19 something, then more women, known as the suffragettes, demonstrated in the suffrage movement. There were also some men demonstrating for it. Demonstrated for also the right to vote, so that they can also have a little voice, at least as a normal population, as all have, to say what the politics should be in the country in which we are living in. And with that, we are through with the right to vote. Living a little bit at the outsides, this is to say, yes. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, an increased number of women campaigned and demonstrated for greater rights and, in particular, the right to vote. They formed the women's suffrage movement and became known as suffragettes. They're always pointing out in these quotes on the outside the happy end. The island knot. So what we should always remember is the happy end and not the story. We will do all. And as I said, we should do last exercise. We will do nothing new anymore. The last exercise, it's a bit extreme exercise. So I'll try it in this direction maybe. So you have a good standing leg, and you bring the other leg high up, and you go down in one straight line down. The upper part of the body comes straight down. Foot is flexed off the swinging leg, and you try to have a tall standing leg to bring pressure onto the biceps for most of a standing leg. And we're doing a few more. And for last. And now we're changing the leg, the other leg. On the ground. The swinging leg has a flexed foot. Bringing the flexed foot high up. Trying to sit stable. The upper part of the body comes down in a straight line. The leg back also comes mostly straight as possible back. Having a tall standing leg, we don't fall in the abdomen. And we're trying to have a tall standing leg to bring the pressure onto the biceps tendons of the hamstrings. And the last four. And just the last exercise, the trunk igniter at the end. So we're breathing in and out, and out, and again in, and out, and again in, and out. We're breathing in and closing the legs, and out, and we're done with the leg stretching. And the next part, and when we have Emmeline Pankhurst. So, I think we might enter the next part to Emmeline